one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. When we're dealing with the Ramseys and statement analysis, you need to know not only the two police statements John and Patsy made, you need to know those like the back of your hand, but also there are very many other statements made on camera. Their interviews with Larry King and Barbara Walters, as well as what they wrote in their own book. There are also depositions to consider, as well as the versions of events recorded by the police and detectives separate to all of this. And some of these police and detectives went on to write books of their own on this case, noting and emphasizing some discrepancies. In other words, if you're going to analyze body language or statement analysis or both, you really need to be able to do that in context. And so I've written a couple of books on this case. What happens when you do analyze it in context? Well, there's some surprising things. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started.
And we both went to the basement and first went into what we call the train room, which is where we found the open window.
So if you go back actually just a few seconds before he makes the statement, he says he doesn't know when this was. Well, I can tell you when it was. It was very close to 1 p.m. It might have been 4 minutes past 1 in the afternoon. That was when they went down there. Now, that's quite important, the time they went down there, because there were other times that people went down into the basement. This wasn't the first time that they'd gone down there. Now, according to officers French and Veach, there were no obvious signs of forcible entry. So when the officers arrived on scene, they went through the whole house and tried to, including the basement, and tried to find some sign that an intruder had broken in, and they couldn't find that. And they asked the Ramseys about that, and the Ramseys said that they believed that the house was locked when they went to bed. So if the open, broken window was such an obvious sign of forced entry that he's going to mention it in, for example, this interview. Well, look, we found this open, broken window. Why did no one know about it? Why did no one seem to care about it until after JonBenet was found? And it wasn't even that they knew or cared about it like immediately after she was found. It's something that only came up much later, right? So let me reiterate, because we know that John went down to the basement early in the morning, and he's admitted this. We know that Fleet White, John's friend, went into the basement earlier, separately from John. And we also know that Officer French went down into the basement earlier. French even went right up to that basement door where JonBenet was behind it, and he simply tried it and found it locked, and then he left it at that. Well, Fleet White actually opened it, couldn't find the light switch, but it came that close for Fleet White to find JonBenet in that room. Now, the truth is, the open, broken window only became a big deal after the fact. In its own small way, the window having a life of its own is similar to the concocted ransom note. You seem to have circumstances, whatever they are, and then the narrative afterwards seems to give you a different sense of those circumstances. Now, one imagines the first thing the Ramseys were asked by law enforcement was signs of forced entry. Well, if there weren't any, then they'd be in trouble, wouldn't they?
We looked there for glass, again, to see if we could find any glass, because the window was not only open, it was broken.
So, yeah, once again, he reiterates, he says twice that there was glass. He's emphasizing the fact that the window is broken. And he also says for a second time that the window was open. And the thing that he doesn't really acknowledge was that they looked for glass and they didn't really find any. So if an intruder had broken in there, you would have found glass, but there was virtually no glass there. So what's that all about? John doesn't say in this interview that he'd broken the window. John said that he'd gone to the basement earlier that morning at about 10, found the window open and closed it. Those are his words. And this would explain why others may have observed it closed. But then if you found a possible point of entry in the hours, hours and hours sitting around with the police, from 6 a.m. till 1 p.m., that's 7 hours that you're sitting around with the police. Why didn't John mention this to anyone? It also raises another question. Why would John admit to both breaking and closing the window? And you might say, if John is guilty, why would he admit to both breaking and closing the window? Well, one possibility is it might explain why his fingerprints or DNA could be on the point of egress rather than some unknown intruders. But the entire window thing is rendered moot because CSI Everett, the guy who documented the scene, the guy who took photos and recorded video, you can actually see in the famous photo of the basement window, it's actually taken at night. I think it was taken the night of the 27th of December. Right? And this CSI found a spider's web over a significant portion of the window. It would be impossible to enter or exit through the window without pulling out that web. Besides this, vegetation and debris on the outside of the window wasn't trampled or disturbed. And there were also accounts saying that there were no footprints in the snow leading to that particular grate. Now we can talk at length just about the intrigue surrounding the window. If you want me to do that, we can dedicate a separate episode, a separate analysis to that. But now let's go on to the third observation.
I immediately took the tape off of her mouth, tried to untie her arms were bound above her head. I tried to untie the knot, and I couldn't get it untied. Her skin was cool to the touch.
So unless you've seen some of the quite saddening, tragic, troubling images of JonBenet with these, in this position that she was found in, I think it's harder to think about this insightfully. I'm saying if you haven't seen it. But if you think about it, why does John start off with all these little details besides JonBenet? So he's finding, her arms above her head and there's string and whatnot. But the first thing a person would do in that situation is check for signs of life. The first thing you would do is perhaps call out her name. The first thing you would probably do is touch her skin and try to find a pulse and check whether she's breathing. But the first thing he does, and if you think about it, he's emphasizing, in a way, the intruder narrative, step by step, box by box that he's ticking. He's emphasizing the intruder narrative. He's putting it front and center into your mind that there's an intruder. And so what would make sense in this case is if he first try to make sure that there were signs of life in this brief little snippet of his narrative. Instead, it's kind of at the end of that. He says, well, she was cool to the touch. And I don't think that's accurate. I think cold is the more accurate term here. And he does say that her lips were blue. I don't think if she had died that she would be cool to the touch. Remember, she was lying on a cold floor in the basement of a wine cellar. Remember, cold air sinks. And also, this is one of the coldest days of the year, cold enough for trace amounts of snow to fall. So the word cool, if you ask me, confuses a potential time of death estimate. And this is something that 27 years later is not clear. When did JonBenet die? Some people think she died Christmas night. But there's kind of a long period of uncertainty, several hours. And so the question is, did she die later on? And so that's why she was still cool, because she died not that long ago, right? And she died at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I think it's more likely that JonBenet had been dead for at least 11 hours, that she died, she'd been dead for about 11 hours, which is more than enough time for her skin to go cold. Now, the other thing that's quite interesting with this idea of her temperature, the temperature of her skin, well, the wrapping of JonBenet in a blanket, interestingly, may have been an attempt to confuse the time of death by preserving her body heat. Because, again, the earlier JonBenet died, the more likely her parents were awake or awakened, and the more opportunity they theoretically had to take actions to deal with the situation. Have you ever had that thought? Have you ever thought about that aspect in this case? Have you thought about it that deeply? The converse is also true. The later JonBenet is estimated to have died, the less time there is to do staging. Worth noting is that JonBenet's gravestone bears the date of her death as December 25th. I believe that date is incorrect. And this is why one of the best tools to interrogate the Ramsey case is via the timeline. That is something I want to dig into more detail. The timeline as this really incredible tool to solve true crime cases. Now let's go on to number 4.
Then I went to the room where we did find JonBenet. The door was latched. I unlatched and pulled it open, and instantly what I found. Well, it was a rush of relief, but also fear because her eyes were closed. I immediately took the tape off of her mouth, tried to untie her arms were bound above her head. I tried to untie the knot, and I couldn't get it untied.
So what's quite interesting with the way he starts that statement is he talks about the room where we found her. Now, I've got an idea that where JonBenet actually died is not where she was found. And I do think she was taken to the room where she was found, because if she was left in the original room, then that would potentially implicate someone. And so it is an interesting question as well. If JonBenet didn't die where she was found, then where was she, and who was she with, and how did she die? Now, one thing that many people don't know about is there's little pieces of glass around her body, little pieces of kind of sparkly material, which is a broken ornament that actually possibly came from a Christmas tree. Now, that decoration either came from the original crime scene, or it's possible that was broken in the basement. I do think it's very interesting if that broken material actually came from some other room, possibly the lounge, where there were Christmas trees. And of course there were Christmas trees in all the rooms of the house, including the bedrooms. So that does raise quite an interesting question. The other thing that's interesting is he talks about how her arms are bound above her head, and that he tried to untie the knot, but he couldn't get it untied, which suggests that she was bound tightly, but no, her wrists were actually loosely tied. According to the autopsy, she was found with one hand free of the cord, so one part of the cord was actually just brushed aside, and the coroner said the other was easy to remove. The other thing that John Ramsey emphasizes is the duct tape. He doesn't say anything about trying to discover whether JonBenet is breathing or not. He seems to instantly know the result, and then he feels relief. Does that make sense, that you would instantly feel relief, but you also instantly know what you're dealing with? Most people in a situation like that would probably need a little bit of time to establish beyond any doubt that a person is alive or not. And certainly just seeing that their eyes are closed isn't going to tell you anything. John actually gives more information about the window than he does about his daughter. He doesn't talk about the pallor of her skin. He mentions very quickly that her lips were blue, but he doesn't really mention much besides that. He doesn't mention that she had injuries. There's like a red mark on her chest, and he doesn't really mention much detail around his daughter. Besides the paraphernalia covering her, for example, the duct tape, the cords.
One of the most unusual parts of this has been this Ransom note, and I know that you've seen it several times, but would you go over it with us and tell us what you know and what you've been told about it?
Well, first of all, this is what is going to help us convict the killer. This is 3 pages of handwritten writing samples of the killer. We've been told by experts that if we have a suspect and we get sufficient samples of his writing, they will be able to tell conclusively with this much of a sample that the person wrote that note. So this is a huge clue.
It's interesting how John puts on his glasses, studies the note for about 5 seconds, and then says absolutely nothing about it. No reference to its content, doesn't quote a single sentence, and then what he does say is absolutely obvious. It's an important clue. Well, yes, tell us something we don't know. Then he also says, if we have a suspect and we get sufficient samples of his writing, like Gary Oliver, if after enough samples you can eventually then match it to someone like Gary Oliver. And what's quite interesting, and I don't know if people know this, the investigators struggled to find samples of Patsy's handwriting. So they even went to the house in Charlevoix, Michigan, to try and find handwriting that was sort of lying around. And the housekeeper said that Patsy was a note writer, that she was constantly writing Post-its. And suddenly when they want to see samples of her handwriting, well, now that's quite difficult to come by. Interestingly, in a photo that was brought up during a deposition, Dana Hoffman asked, and this is a family photo, as far as I remember, he asked, do you recognize that as your handwriting? And Patsy said no. And I don't know about you, but how often is somebody else's handwriting in a family photo album? And how often can you not recognize your own handwriting? The other thing that's interesting about this is just the use of the word his, where he says we can get sufficient samples of his writing. Well, is implying here that the writer is a man, when many have surmised that the tone of the note is more likely authored by a woman, because there are words like attaché and gentleman. And by the way, the reference to gentleman was something that Patsy mentioned somewhere else, which she referred to. I think she was asked to write a note, she was asked to provide another sample, and she actually said, I'm sitting in a room with 2 gentlemen. Anyway, so that is also quite similar. But terms like good Southern common sense, would a man more likely use a term like that, or a woman? And also, I advise you to be well rested. Now on to number 6.
This is a huge clue. Why it was left, I don't know.
Why it was left, I don't know. Now, this isn't an admission that the intruder theory makes no sense. The ransom note assumes it was written by an intruder. Well, why would an intruder ask for money, make claims about what was going on, and then not even take JonBenet or call to claim the ransom? What's that all about? So what's more likely, a nonsensical ransom note written by a nonsensical intruder who never took JonBenet to begin with, or a staged crime scene to protect perhaps a family member? On to number 7.
And let me just interject at this point. Mrs. Ramsey, it's my understanding that the Colorado Bureau of Investigation took your handwriting samples to the Secret Service. Do you know the results of that test? Definitively?
No, I don't. No, we had experts do the same kind of testing, and it's my understanding that the people that we use trained the people from the CBI, Colorado Bureau, that administered the tests.
If you know the Ramseys and you've spent some time looking at their statements, you can tell they are sometimes incredible sticklers for detail, and then other times there's very little detail. So, for example, Patsy has also showed the ransom note, and Patsy, of course, has been someone implicated as the writer of the ransom note. Patsy doesn't have a word to say about the ransom note. She doesn't say anything about the handwriting, doesn't say whether her handwriting is neater, bigger, smaller, anything about it. It's all very general when it comes to that. And, that's something where you think about the reporter. The reporter's handed them the note, a copy of it, a facsimile. It's right in front of them, and they've got nothing to say about any of the content of the note. Instead, the details are about the people who were their experts, basically trained the experts that law enforcement used, which is a slight dig to say, well, our experts were better. But and I've got to say, on this question, Patsy, do you know the results of that test, the test done by the Secret Service? Are you really telling me that Patsy didn't know? Because there were something like 5 samples that law enforcement did. That's besides all the testing that Patsy's people did. Patsy did 5 separate handwriting samples on 5 different occasions. And regardless of that, Patsy's body language is very, very revealing. In her interviews, Patsy comes across very well informed. She isn't afraid to remind her interviewers of her precision accuracy when it comes to certain details. And yet when it comes to the most important information dealing with her, what law enforcement, the prosecution side, think of her handwriting, well, apparently she doesn't know. She doesn't seem to be aware of it. I don't think anyone has to be a genius to realize the cops did repeated tests on Patsy because they suspected her, because they saw some similarity. We also know that by the 4th handwriting sample, and I've covered this on my channel, they asked Patsy to write with her other hand, her left hand, and because they discovered that Patsy was ambidextrous. Not from Patsy, though. Now, according to an article in the Denver Post dated October 17th, 1999, in other words, it's an article in the media predating the Ramsey's interview with Paula Woodward. This interview was in 2000, and this is following the publication of their book. After comparing one Patsy, this is a quote from that article, after comparing one Patsy handwriting sample to the ransom note, Chet Ubowski of the CBI concluded this handwriting showed indications that the writer was Patsy Ramsey. Now, John has said that it was at best inconclusive. I wouldn't say that this is at best inconclusive. I would say what he says. It showed indications that the writer was Patsy Ramsey. But I think the big insight here isn't so much the details regarding the handwriting. I think Patsy's facial expressions are so illuminating here, because on the one hand you could say Patsy just finds this silly, but aren't they trying to find the killer of their child? So what's silly, what's amusing about it? What's amusing about being suspected in something that is this serious? On the other hand, if Patsy did write the note, and if she succeeded in fooling almost everyone, then that's a demonstration, isn't it, that she's smarter than everyone in the room. So what is actually going on in Patsy's mind when the ransom note comes up? Is she thinking she's better and smarter than everyone else, that she's outsmarted everyone, including the reporters who don't have a clue? And so are we dealing with duping delight, if that is the case?
No, I don't. No, we had experts do the same kind of testing. And
did you know that the Ramseys hired 5 handwriting experts? Why did the Ramseys hire 5 of their own experts? Let me say that again. If it is incontrovertible, if there was no doubt about the penmanship of the ransom note, why did Team Ramsey need to hire a single handwriting expert, let alone 5? And if you know the media narrative, you know that as early as 11 April 1997, Patsy was given a 4th sample. This is in the media. She was given a 4th sample that she needed to demonstrate her handwriting. And it appeared, it was confirmation that she was ambidextrous. And none of this is acknowledged in this interview. There's no volunteering. By the way, I gave 5 samples to the police, and also I'm ambidextrous. None of that's volunteered. So curiously, when it came to the legality of the testimony, the Ramseys challenged the prosecution experts on the basis that their experts had access to the original note, which is an important point. It's an important advantage, while the original note was later destroyed, thus permanently depriving independent experts from examining the original. And some might say that's awfully convenient. Well, guess what? There was one expert, Chet Ubowski, who did analyze the original note, so much so that he actually left the only fingerprint on that note. And it's this handwriting expert that said that he believes, certainly from the left-hand sample, that it seems to show indications that it could be Patsy Ramsey. I also think if you are trying to disguise your handwriting, then it's not going to be a perfect match. If there's an effort made to try to disguise your handwriting, then you aren't going to have absolutely conclusive proof. What's also fascinating, certainly in the light of the Charlotte Cena case, where they not only found fingerprints and DNA, they also found DNA on that note. Well, there was zero DNA found on the Ramsey ransom note. So even if the Ramseys are innocent, did no one actually ever pick up the ransom note with their bare hands and read it? They didn't leave fingerprints and they didn't leave DNA. And that absence of evidence is really odd. There's a ransom note in your home, but for some reason you don't actually touch it. And here you have the ransom note, or copy of it, presented to both John and Patsy, and they've really got very little to say about the details. Even the reporter doesn't say anything about the many movie references in the ransom note. And of course, in the basement area where John Bonet was found, but that basic area, the train room area, there are a bunch of movie posters. There's something like 4 or 5 or 6 movie posters in that area. And so it does appear that the Ramseys liked reading bestsellers, and they also liked, well, some of them seem to really enjoy watching movies. Certainly based on their decor. Of course, the reporter doesn't ask anything about that.
Yeah, we don't know the results of the police testing. We've heard that they're at best inconclusive.
It's quite interesting, the sort of penetrating stare that John gives when he says this. And as I say, if he says he doesn't know what the results are of the test, well, did you not read the newspapers? Because that's not what was said in the news in 1999. And what was said wasn't that it was inconclusive. And the other thing that you never hear about, you never hear anyone talking about the grand jury, their assessment. If the grand jury voted to indict the Ramseys, is that because they thought somebody else wrote the ransom note? Is that because the people who were on the jury accepted the evidence of the experts that Patsy didn't write the note? Or was it because they accepted perhaps what the housekeeper said, that the housekeeper said, I'm not sure what she did say, I think she said that she thought she did recognize Patsy's handwriting, or that it resembled it. But if the housekeeper did say that, who do you think, whose version did the grand jury ultimately accept?
That exists. And we're never going to change that. And we're not trying to convince the bad people and the cynics and the hateful people that we loved our daughter and that we didn't kill her. We're trying to appeal to the good people.
So the people that suspect the Ramseys are bad, they're cynics and they're hateful. The people who don't suspect the Ramseys are good, they're kind and they're rational people. So I guess the bad people then are quite a big bunch. It includes the Boulder PD, the CBI, the FBI, and the grand jury, and also all the media who over the years haven't supported them. So if they're not trying to convince the bad people, why is it necessary to convince the good people in interview after interview, documentary after documentary, who already believe them? It's because I think they are trying to convince. And let me ask you something. Did the ransom note try to convince people of something? The answer is yes. And further, it succeeded. It also succeeded in hiding the true perpetrator of this crime. But 27 years later, is the ransom note still convincing? Are you convinced by it? You know, the ransom note, we knew at 1 p.m. on the day after Christmas in 1996, we knew that it was an elaborate ruse and a lie. But it created enough of a diversion, enough interference to buy the people responsible, whoever they were, the time they needed, time they would never have had without it. And think about the weeks that went by trying to match Patsy's handwriting compared to if there had been no note. Just think about the ransom note as a diversion in terms of the investigation. Now, I want to quickly run through a couple of comments on some of the panelists. You know, when I look at micro expressions, I look at dozens. Even in a short clip, and in an hour-long interview, there can be hundreds, if not thousands. So it's surprising to me that if your expertise, you've got not just that's your expertise, but you've got 4 people. So it's for expertise times 4, multiplied by 4 in terms of behavioral analysis. It's just surprising to me that there's so little focus on those details. Anyway, if we go to about 151 from their episode, Mark says, there are some discrepancies for me as well, but in terms of out-and-out deception, I'm good. It's pretty honest to me. Now, if one of the Ramseys wrote the ransom note, and some of the authorities believe one of them did, wouldn't you call that out-and-out deception? So who does this panel believe wrote the note? And do they have an opinion on that? If we go to 148.30 in their episode, Greg says, if you work for a company, I don't know how big this one is. Well, let me tell you, it's big. With $1 billion in turnover achieved just days before John Bonet's death, it is a very big company. John was actually voted Entrepreneur of the Year, I think, for the Boulder Business Club or something like that. Is John's business relevant? Well, you bet your bottom dollar it is. John actually sold the company for a huge amount of money shortly after this crime happened. So I think it's reckless to flippantly say, I don't know much about Access Graphics. Look, it's been 26 years. It's even on Wikipedia. Maybe make some effort to find out a little bit more about it. Chase suggests a theory near the end, and he further says, if one accepts this hypothetical, I'm not going to repeat it here, but he says if one accepts this particular hypothetical, then all these things that don't seem to make sense, and I assume that would include the ransom note, well, he says with this scenario in play, everything then does make sense. Greg then kind of undoes what he says by saying something went on in this house that we can't see. Nobody can see. There's probably some guilty knowledge, some hidden information that we can't have access to. He says this is a complex case. There's a lot more to it than any of us know. And he adds, it'll probably never be solved. This is in the final 2 minutes after almost 3 hours in a video titled, John Bonet, What Happened and Who Really Killed Her? If we're talking discrepancies and deception, isn't the promise of this particular episode, certainly in the title, to say, we're going to tell you what happened. We're going to reveal who we think killed John Bonet. Well, do they? He also says, we can hope that somebody heard something and that they're going to come forward.
Find an ending. But don't cheat. And don't you dare bring in a Deus Ex Machina.
But that sounds like we do want a Deus Ex Machina solution to this case. Thinking that, well, we must hope that somebody heard something and that they're going to come forward. By the way, do you know that somebody did hear something? A neighbor, Melody Stanton, heard a child screaming and that scream was cut off. But the point is, if we always hope for that in true crime, that someone's going to come forward or someone's going to confess, then everyone should really just hand in their detective badges. Lawyers and judges, cops and prosecutors, they might as well become street sweepers and buskers. Because the only way to solve difficult cases is if perpetrators tell us what they did. Or if someone hands us CCTV video of the whole thing. Because without that, we would never know. That's crazy. So we can't actually figure things out by following the evidence, figuring things out. I mean, what did the grand jury do? I do agree with Greg that John didn't kill John Bonet, but that's hardly a revelation. Most people don't believe that. Most people who know this case don't think that John killed John Bonet. So saying that is it's kind of obvious. I think those who do believe John did it, and this is in my experience, have the shallowest understanding of the Ramsey case. And you can either be insulted by that or you can be challenged by that. You can say, okay, let me find out a bit more about it. Or you can say, oh, I'm insulted, unsubscribe. Well, fair enough. But it's an absurd thing to even raise after almost 3 hours of analysis. John was never even the focus of the police investigation. John was never the subject of who wrote the ransom note. So it's not even really necessary to say, I don't think John did it. I want to ask you how much value there is in behavior analysis, not like just as a question, but behavior analysis in a vacuum. And what I mean is, let me put it this way. I think behavior analysis is a very valuable tool. And you often hear the defense people saying everyone grieves differently, and affect is a very important sign that something doesn't look or feel right. It's very subjective as well, and of course it's not enough, but it's the beginning. I mean, with Laurie Vallow, they said, after Charles Vallow had died, that she seemed far too chirpy in the police cruiser afterwards. That turned out to be true. Anyway, when you know a case back to front, then behavior analysis is a valuable tool, but that's when you have the context. But where you say, I don't know what the grand jury decided here, I don't know what the media narrative is, I don't know what's in the police statements, I haven't read the Ramsey's book, I haven't kept track of the evolution of their statements, well then how can the body language analysis of a single statement carry any weight? So what I'm going to do is just look at the lips and eyes and try to discern the truth that way. So let me ask you, without context, what do any of these discrepancies really mean? You're saying something doesn't look completely right here, but I'm not sure what it means. How much value does that have, that assessment? In the final minute, Greg ponders why John is bringing up the John Bonet case in the last years of his life, instead of just letting it quietly go away. And I do think this is a good question. I do think it's a relevant and important question. But he uses that question to explain John's innocence, but actually doesn't explain why John might want to do that. Besides that, if you say, besides John's innocence, why would he want to be doing what he's doing? Well, if John is innocent and he wants to demonstrate his innocence, and John is in his third marriage, which he is, then perhaps his audience is his third wife. After all, how would it look if your daughter has died, the killer is apparently out there, and you quietly letting America forget about you? Well, there's the context to that. So if you're trying to understand the human behavior out of context, out of a textuality, outside of the fabric that is woven out of it, is it any wonder that at the end of 3 hours of analysis, or almost, there seems to be an admission that we don't know what happened here? But then shouldn't that be in the title? We've looked at this and we don't know what the answer is. So again, my question is body language alone ever going to be the solution to unsolved cases? Is it ever going to be the solution to this case? Well, at the last time I looked, 130,000 people seem to believe it can be. And you might say, well, I don't think you can do any better. Well, I'm not trying to do better, but I do think one's got to look at it in context. And what's the other side to that? I think one's got to not just look at things like lips and looks and the body language, but one's got to look at the words. One's got to look at those two together, the words and the facial expressions together, and what can one take from that, and then also cross-reference that to the fabric, to the context that we know. So anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that. I apologize for not syncing the audio perfectly, but this is a very long video, at least twice as long as the longest videos that I make. Let me know if you'd like me to do a TCRS analysis of the 1 hour interview with Paula Woodward. If I do that, I'll probably do it in a live format and take you guys through it piece by piece. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do that. I'm also keen to share with you guys the TCRS toolbox, a tool from the TCRS toolbox, which I think is so important. And you've seen it touched on a little bit in this analysis, which is the timeline. The timeline is something that can't be changed. It can be, you can sort of influence it, or you can try and influence it, and hopefully amnesia sets in. But the timeline is one of the best ways to figure out what really happened in a case. And so I'm looking forward to sharing that with you guys. We'll probably use the timeline of the Morphew case as a test case scenario. Thank you for listening. I hope you guys are having a good week, and I'll see you guys next time.